Well, good evening, friends. I will. Om Tavakatam Ritam Tapta Jivanam Kavibiriditam Kalmashapaham Sharavana Mangalam Shri Madatatam Bhuvingaranantiye Burida Janaha. The nectar of your words, the praise of poet seers, elixir to parched souls, delight to listening ears, cleanser of all sins is great and glorious. They who spread it far and wide on earth are most generous. Om peace, peace, peace. Good evening, friends. Today we will continue with the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. And for those that are following us, we are on page 172. The last time we met, Sri Ramakrishna mentioned that during the Kali Yuga, this present age, that Bhakti Yoga was the path most suitable and the easiest path for anyone that wants to realize God during this age, and the best path for most of us. But as we continue, he's going to describe several kinds of bhakti. So when we say bhakti, that is the general category, but there are specific types of bhakti which have their specific experiences, and they start at different levels. So we will start with that. So Sri Ramakrishna mentions, but it isn't any and every kind of bhakti that enables one to realize God. One cannot realize God without prema bhakti. Another name for prema bhakti is raga bhakti, which means supreme love, which makes one attached only to God. God cannot be realized without love and longing. Unless one has learnt to love God, one cannot realize Him. So he's saying one has to learn Bhakti Yoga. It doesn't come naturally. So there's another name for the type of path when you are just learning Bhakti, and he calls that Vaidhi Bhakti. But just to clarify, as I mentioned, Bhakti is, as a word describes, it's like a general term, but we just came across the word Prema Bhakti and Raga Bhakti. But here in the Gospel it says, another name for Prema Bhakti is Raga Bhakti. But there's a slight difference between the two. Prema Bhakti is supreme love of God, it's ecstatic love of God, where it's the most intense kind of divine love that one can have for God. As opposed to Raga Bhakti, which they translate as supreme love. But it's a love that makes one attached only to God. So Vaidhi Bhakti, as I mentioned, is a practice of developing bhakti and increasing that love to the point of where you are now becoming more and more attached to God. As that attachment becomes your only attachment, where you are no longer attached to worldly things, that is called Raga Bhakti. But as that matures, that becomes Prema Bhakti. So, slight difference there. But one can experience God at Raga Bhakti. But a higher form of that is when a more intense experience would be called Prema Bhakti. So now he says, there is another kind of bhakti known as Vaidhi Bhakti. according to which one must repeat the name of God a fixed number of times, fast, make pilgrimages, worship God with prescribed offerings, make so many sacrifices, and so forth and so on. By continuing such practices a long time, one gradually acquires raga bhakti. God cannot be realized until one has raga bhakti. One must love God in order to, one must love God. In order to realize God, one must be completely free from worldliness and direct all of one's mind to Him. So part of this Vaidhi Bhakti, as we mentioned, is like ritualistic worship. However, that is just a part of it. The other part, to effectively do any kind of ritualistic worship, you have to develop a personal relationship with God. So that requires practice and remembrance. So, and then it's not, yes, you may put aside some time in your day to do ritualistic worship, but you have to be able to make that part of every other activity. So ritualistic worship is where you sit down and make a disciplined, concentrated effort to develop love of God. But that has to translate to actions when you leave the shrine or leave your meditation seat into your everyday practices, your everyday activities. Only then does it become established to the point where no matter what distractions, no matter what happens during the day, still your mind can offer all of that to God. So, as I mentioned, we start with a relationship to God or our chosen ideal, and we will worship God or a form of God, whichever appeals to our mind. It should be a form that we feel some love and attachment to. That makes it easier from our point of view. And we are not just offering our actions, we are also offering the fruits of our actions. So we may do something, we may get praise, may be blamed in our daily activities, but we have to know how to offer the praise and the blame to God, the good and the bad, and to the point where we do not let those things penetrate into our mind to the point of upsetting us and distracting us from our goal of trying to acquire love of God. So often something may distract us and we brood over it, not just for a few moments, but for hours and then days, to the point where we become miserable. Well, we have to overcome that. Those periods of time have to become shorter and shorter, to the point where the instant something is thrown at us, we offer it to God. We don't take it personally. We don't hold it in. We offer it to God. When we hold it in, our ego has gotten hurt. We're attached to it because of our egos has been damaged. But the quicker we get rid of it, the less time there is for our ego to become attached to it and for us to get flustered and upset. So, but in order to acquire this raga bhakti, it's not just some spurious worship or spurious spiritual practice that we do when we have time. We actually have to it has to be a disciplined part of our day. A time that we set aside. It is a ritual that we make as part of our day. And we should be able to try to do that regardless of how our day, whether we are tired or exhausted, at least try to put in some effort to do that. because no effort goes unwasted. Even if we have to fall asleep, after a hard day's work, but still we've put aside, we try to make effort. And gradually that we overcome those obstacles. So what would this be like in a more practical sense? Is there any worldly kind of experience that we might have that helps us understand what Raga Bhakti might be like? Well, if we think of a musician who might be introduced to an instrument, they develop some love for that instrument, and so then they feel encouraged to practice every little bit of improvement. They say, oh, I can do this, so they keep practicing. They start playing music that they like to play, their favorite kind of music. That inspires them to play a little better, to the point where they find joy in the practice. So in worship or meditation, there comes a point where you find joy in the practice. And when you miss that opportunity to perform meditation or music or whatever activity you feel attracted to, you will miss it. And you'll feel it in your heart that you've missed it. And so you'll either say, well, I'll do better next time, or you'll resolve to become more disciplined, or you'll just find some other time to do it. Perhaps you missed it at 6 a.m., but you'll find time maybe later in the day, because you don't want to miss it. There comes a point where you don't want to miss it. So also, as you practice these spiritual disciplines, you realize that, well, this is actually helping me in life by following this discipline. It keeps me calm, it keeps me centered, and so you find joy in that experience, and so you persist, and you'll make sacrifices for it. You'll decide, well, no, maybe I won't go to that movie. I missed my meditation early in the day. I will sit down now and do it. Even though it was a movie that you might have really wanted to watch, but no, you'll say, no, maybe it's better I just honor my commitment to this practice. So you develop a love for the practice. So, and you will sacrifice for it, and you will offer the results of that to God. And if you do that enough times, even that sense of ego kind of gets weaker and weaker. You feel like you are doing this for God. You're not doing it for yourself. So in your mind, you're kind of thinking, not I, but thou. You're constantly, you just want to give. You don't want to take from God. You want to give. So, and the more we progress, the deeper becomes our understanding. Just as when we concentrate on something that we really want to know, the more we concentrate, the deeper our understanding becomes of that subject. The same happens with God. The deeper we try to think and concentrate on God or our chosen ideal or whatever imagery we are using, we are developing a deeper understanding of what that image represents, what God is. But there also comes a point when we realize that no matter how much practice we put into something, the goal still keeps getting further and further. It's almost like you can never be as perfect as you thought you could be, because the closer you approach, your ideal has also increased. It's gotten higher. So we find that at some point we feel humbled by the fact that by our own efforts, we don't seem to be able to reach the goal. At that point, we basically resign and become dependent on God. And when that happens, then that's when you develop true humility, true dependence on God. And that's when you start to depend on God's grace. but that doesn't mean you shouldn't give up your practices either. So, just Sri Ramakrishna has said that if you take one step toward God, God takes 10 steps toward you. So, or you could say, well, God helps those that help themselves. So that's just another way of saying that. And the more things that we can offer to God, the more attachments that we offer to God, that is sublimating our attachments to become our attachments become attachments to God itself, or the ideal itself. And when one has developed such attachment to God, the ego also seems to vanish to the point of, well, who is worshiping whom? So does spiritual practice stop? Well, at that point, that is when you have reached the highest that you can reach in Raga Bhakti. And as you keep practicing, that Raga Bhakti becomes Prema Bhakti. But now Sri Ramakrishna is saying, but some acquire Raga Bhakti directly. They're not going through all these practices. So he's saying it is innate in them. So he often says, well, some people seem to show such strong devotion to God already at a very young age. So he says that perhaps they have done their spiritual practices in their previous life. And so now they are just continuing from where they left off. So you might say, well, that's like a music prodigy or someone who seemingly seems to be so skilled in music at such a young age. So yes, there can be spiritual prodigies, just as there can be music prodigies or other intellectual prodigies. So it is innate in them. They have it from their very childhood. Even at an early age, they weep for God. An instance of such bhakti can be found in Prahlada. Vaidhi bhakti is like moving a fan to make a breeze. So yes, you do your practices in order to increase your love of God, but you're putting effort into it. So yes, you're chanting the name of God, you're offering worship and articles to God, you're offering your actions, the fruits of your labor to God. You're making conscious effort. So that's like you're revving up your engine so you can experience God, sort of. So Vaidhi Bhakti is like moving a fan to make a breeze. One needs the fan to make the breeze. Similarly, one practices japa, austerity, and fasting in order to acquire love of God. But the fan is set aside when the southern breeze blows of itself. So once the engine is going and the wind of God's grace is there, then the same amount of effort is not required. But still, some practice has to be continued. Otherwise, even the breeze may slow down. So such actions as japa and austerity drop away when one spontaneously feels love and attachment for God. So, who indeed will perform the ceremonies and join in the scriptures when one is mad with love of God? And at that point, that Vaidhi Bhakti has become Raga Bhakti. But when one that is when one's mind is completely attached to God and no longer attached to the world, and it cannot be dragged down back to the attachment of the world. Then one becomes established in Raga Bhakti, and can experience God. Prolonged experience will then lead to prema bhakti. So now he continues and he says, devotion to God may be said to be green, so long as it doesn't grow into love of God. Here he's alluding to unripe fruit being green. So he's calling this as unripe bhakti. So devotion to God may be said to be green, so long as it doesn't grow into love of God. So at first you might be doing your rituals and your worship kind of mechanically, just chanting the name of God so many times. You're just basically learning to concentrate your mind on God. And you're doing it more out of duty, but with the hope of acquiring some kind of benefit from it. So at first it will be of that category. So, but by continued practice and trying to love God, gradually it becomes more of a habit. And then through that habit, you might develop some sense of love for performing such actions. So it becomes, he says, it becomes ripe when it has grown. Pardon me. So long as this devotion to God may be said to be green, so long as it doesn't grow into love of God. But it becomes ripe when it has grown into such love. A man with green bhakti cannot assimilate spiritual talk and instruction, but one with ripe bhakti can. So while you're still doing things kind of mechanically, you don't really have a firm grasp on understanding instruction or spiritual talk. Yes, you'll have many questions, but it may be difficult to understand all the implications of what you're being taught. But that understanding comes as you keep up with the practice, because now you're concentrating on something with a goal in mind. That concentration and with keeping that goal in mind, as basically that sense of worldliness, your worldly attachments start diminishing, that's acting like a cloud that's obstructing your understanding. So that has to kind of diminish somewhat. So once the ritualistic worships and so forth become innate and more of a habit and start consuming time of your day, then that's less time for you to start dwelling on worldly endeavors and worldly thought. And then as that moves into your daily activities, where you're starting to offer your worldly activities to God, then your understanding will deepen. Because your mind is thinking more and more on that subject. So you'll be able to concentrate better on what spiritual instruction you're receiving and understand it in the proper context. So now he's using an analogy. He's saying that the image that falls on a photographic plate covered with black film is retained. So he had previously experienced having a photographer come and take his picture, and he was told how that happens scientifically, that a glass plate has silver nitrate put on it. It's put inside a box, and through a lens, light is exposed to it, and that image is projected on this black surface, which is then developed, and on the glass you can see the image that was projected onto it. So he's using that to explain this analogy. he's saying that the image that falls on a photographic plate covered with black film is retained. On the other hand, thousands of images may be reflected on a bare piece of glass, but not one of them is retained. As the object moves away, the glass becomes the same as it was before. One cannot assimilate spiritual instruction unless one has already developed love of God. So the silver nitrate represents the love that's sitting on the glass plate. And this glass plate is the mind. So the image is retained, the knowledge is retained when you've developed some love of God. That knowledge is retained in the mind. So now Vijay is asking, is bhakti alone sufficient for the attainment of God, for his vision? And the Master says, yes, one can see God through bhakti alone, but it must be ripe bhakti, prema bhakti or raga bhakti. When one has that bhakti, one loves God even as the mother loves the child the mother, or the wife the husband. When one has such love and attachment for God, one doesn't feel the attraction of Maya to wife, children, relatives, and friends. One retains only compassion for them. So here, he is saying that when one has such love and attachment for God, one doesn't feel the attraction of Maya. By this he means they don't feel blind attachment to wife, children, relatives, and friends, but one retains compassion for them. Well, you might wonder, well, why compassion? Well, Maya creates attachment to where one loves what is mine, what I consider mine. So it's either my child, my husband, my car, my this, my that, whatever it is in this world. Maya creates attachment to that. But when one has developed love of God, that kind of attachment becomes reduced or becomes eliminated. It becomes, in Sanskrit the word is daya, translated here as compassion, but daya actually means not love for what is mine, but love for all beings, regardless of whether it's mine or not. So it's an all-encompassing love. The love that one develops with Maya, an attachment, that binds one to this world. But when one has that kind of love that's based on compassion or daya, that liberates one from this world. And when one has that kind of love, when it fills the whole mind, makes every other kind of love feel insipid. It makes that kind of love feel unsatisfactory. It makes that kind of love feel insignificant. And that is when that develops into supreme love. And the more intense that becomes prema bhakti. And at that point, all sense of worldliness will vanish. So Sri Ramakrishna continues and he says, to such a man, the world appears a strange land, a place where he has merely to perform his duties. It is like a man having his real home in the country, but coming to Calcutta for work. He has to rent a house in Calcutta for the sake of his duties. When one develops love of God, one completely gets rid of one's attachment to the world and worldly wisdom. So he says, one cannot see God if one has even the slightest trace of worldliness. Matchsticks, if damp, won't strike fire, though you rub 1,000 of them against the matchbox. You only waste a heap of sticks. The mind soaked in worldliness is like a damp matchstick. Once Sri Radha said to her friends that she saw Krishna everywhere, both within and without. The friends answered, "Why, we don't see him at all. Are you delirious?" Radha said, "Friends, paint your eyes with the collyrium of divine love, and then you will see him." Well, collyrium means like mascara or eyeshadow. So put that, to paint your eyes with that, with divine love. So this brings up a question, because like any endeavor, there are dangers and obstacles on every path. So how do we know that we are actually making spiritual progress and that this is a real vision and that we are not in a state of self-delusion? So Swami Nikhilananda has mentioned in other parts of the Gospel that in the Kali Yuga, to combine Bhakti Yoga with Jnana Yoga. Here he's not mentioned that, but he's, I'm going to bring that up at this point because it's kind of important. How does one know one is not is deluding oneself? So here he's saying, by Jnana Yoga, he's meaning proper reasoning. So how does one know whether one has proper reasoning? Well, you're developing divine love, but now you have to also add some rationality to it by doing some kind of introspection, some self-analysis. Now, on one hand, he says, don't reason too much in Bhakti Yoga, because that might deflate your devotion. But he's not objecting to rationality where it comes to self-analysis and basically cleaning house now and then, checking to see what is the state of my mind. So how to judge whether we are actually making spiritual progress or are we imagining progress? So here, even Sri Radha's friends are asking her, well, is it real or are you imagining? So that's why I'm bringing this up now. So by incorporating a sense of reason into our bhakti, we also avoid becoming fanatical. So even though we are starting out our bhakti practices using imagery and imagination, the difference here is that this imagery and imagination is a lower truth that can lead us to a higher truth. It's still based on truth at this level, but as our insight deepens into the practices and understanding of God, we will get access to higher and higher truths through our spiritual experiences. But how to know which ones are real and genuine? So Swami Nikhilananda has mentioned that if one finds that one's mind rests in God with unwavering devotion and our attraction to worldly objects is diminishing, and that our doubt in the existence of God is decreasing, our doubts are decreasing, then we can feel assured that our experiences are not just mere hallucination, but tending towards real experience by revealing to us higher truths. So that is one way of understanding it. Together with that, we also have to include introspection and self-analysis. Introspection to the point of how sincere are we in our practices? How sincere are we in realizing God? Or are we still kind of on the fence? If we're still on the fence, we still have doubts. So then we should question whether our experiences are real or if our mind is, whether it's a play of the mind. In which case, keep up with the practices. Keep purifying the mind. We also have to maintain constant vigilance of where the mind is going. Is it being attracted back and forth to worldly objects or to worldly life? Because every time we make spiritual progress and then something comes along and kind of like knocks us off our balance, that also sabotages our spiritual progress. We start going down. So we need to be vigilant. Where's our mind going? That's what meditation is for. Sit down and find out where's the mind going. Those are all of that increases the time spent concentrating on God, less and less time spent on worldly activities. All of that helps progress love of God towards increasing one's love for God. So that kind of rationality has to be applied to our bhakti yoga, not just believing blindly whatever we are told, but instead add some rationality to it. So now Sri Ramakrishna continues. He's actually reminded of a song. So to Vijay he says, it is said in the song of your Brahmo Samaj, O Lord, is it ever possible to know thee without love, however much one may perform worship and sacrifice? And then Sri Ramakrishna continues and he says, if the devotee but once feels this attachment and ecstatic love for God, this mature devotion and longing, then he sees God in both his aspects with form and without form. So you put in the effort, God will give you, he will show himself in his different aspects. So up to this point, you've been worshiping God with form. You might have thought, well, that's the only way God exists, with form. But no, if by God's grace, he can also show you all his other forms or aspects without form. So, and Vijay has been asking that. He's been kind of persisting. He wants to know, can God only be realized through bhakti? But what about the jnani who wants to realize God through self-inquiry or through knowledge? Well, here he's saying that no, if one develops love of God, God can bestow the knowledge of his other aspects also. So I will stop there for today, because Vijay has another question coming up that we'll resume from that tomorrow, next week, where he asks, how can one see God? So, if there are any questions, I will try to answer them. In the meantime, while you're thinking, I will give you some announcements. So tomorrow evening, Swami Brahmatmananda will be continuing his reading and discussion of the book Towards the Goal Supreme. This is a Google Meet event. The link will be on the email attachment that was sent to everyone that signed up for notifications. This Friday, Swami Nikhilananda will continue with his series on mantra yoga. It will be class 4, and the topic will be 3 parts of the mantra. And this Saturday at the retreat will be is our monthly Vedanta meditation retreat, where Swami Nikhilananda will be speaking on different aspects of meditation, together with practical instruction and practice. That will be from 1 to 5 p.m. On Sunday, you'll be given a talk here in Seattle. The topic will be the 3 phases of Vedanta philosophy. And he will meet with for questions and answers in our dining hall downstairs. So thank you all very much for attending. I will conclude with a chant. Om Niranjanam Nityam Anantarupam Bhaktanukampa Dritavigraham Vai Ishavataram Paramesamityam Tvam Ramakrishnam Shirasa Namamaha. We salute that Ramakrishna who is without blemish, eternal and infinite in forms, who has assumed human form out of compassion for the devotees, who is God incarnate, the Supreme Lord, and who is most worshipful. Om, peace, peace, peace to all beings.